Indiana is often introduced as a land of highways, cornfields, and the thunder of engines at the Indianapolis 500. But beyond that familiar image lies another, quieter landscape, one marked not by growth but by disappearance. Scattered across the state are places where entire communities once stood, now reduced to fragments of roads, fading foundations, and stories carried only by local memory. These towns did not all vanish for the same reason. Some were sacrificed for large infrastructure projects, others were undone by disease, environmental hardship, or ambitious plans that never quite worked. In some cases, a thriving settlement simply lost its economic purpose and slowly emptied until nothing remained but traces in the woods. Our journey begins in a place locals sometimes refer to as the Drowned Town. Nestled in Brown County, Elkinsville was once a quiet but thriving farming community established in the 1850s. Families worked the surrounding land, schools and churches served the small population, and for generations the town sustained itself through agriculture and close-knit rural life. For more than a century, Elkinsville existed as one of many modest but stable Hoosier communities. Everything changed in the 1960s when the federal government approved construction of the Salt Creek Dam to create Lake Monroe. The reservoir project required thousands of acres of land, and Elkinsville sat directly in the planned flood zone. Residents were forced to sell their property and relocate, bringing an abrupt end to a town that had stood for more than 100 years. Homes, churches, and public buildings were demolished in preparation for the lake's rising water. Yet an unusual twist followed. Although the valley surrounding Elkinsville was cleared for flooding, the waterline of Lake Monroe never actually reached the center of the former town. Instead of resting beneath the lake, the site remained dry, an empty valley where a community once stood. Today, a paved road still runs quietly through the area before ending suddenly at the edge of the forest. Nearby, an old bridge stretches across a creek, seemingly leading to nowhere. Technically, Elkinsville no longer appears on modern maps, but its memory lingers within Hoosier National Forest, where hikers and explorers occasionally pass through the silent landscape that once held a living town. If Elkinsville disappeared through government planning, the story of Hindustan Falls reveals a far darker cause: disease and disaster. Situated along the White River in Martin County, Hindustan Falls was once considered one of the most promising settlements in early Indiana. In the early 19th century, it was predicted to grow into one of the largest cities in the region. The town's location made it ideal for commerce. A busy flour mill operated along the river, serving travelers and settlers moving westward. A hotel and post office supported growing traffic through the area, and the settlement quickly developed into a regional hub. For a brief moment in the early 1800s, Hindustan Falls appeared destined for long-term success. But between 1820 and 1824, catastrophe struck. A deadly epidemic, believed by historians to have been cholera or yellow fever, swept through the population with devastating speed. The outbreak was so severe that the small cemetery could no longer accommodate the number of deaths. Fear spread through the remaining residents, and many fled the town almost overnight, abandoning homes and possessions behind them. Today, only faint traces of Hindustan Falls remain. Along the riverbed, unusual holes carved into the rock still mark where milling equipment. At the edge of Newton County lies the forgotten experiment of Conrad, a town born from bold ambition. Founded in 1908 by entrepreneur Jenny Conrad, the settlement was envisioned as a modern ranching center that would anchor a thriving agricultural economy in northwestern Indiana. Plans for the town included a hotel, a church, a school, and housing for workers who would help build one of the Midwest's largest cattle operations. For a time, the vision appeared promising. Infrastructure rose quickly, and Conrad began to take shape as a planned rural community. But beneath the surface, the land itself posed a serious problem. Much of the surrounding soil consisted of fine sand, left behind by the ancient basin of Kankakee Lake. That sandy terrain made large-scale farming and ranching difficult to sustain. Without productive land, the economic foundation of the town weakened. After Jenny Conrad's death in 1939, the settlement gradually lost its remaining residents. Workers moved away in search of more reliable opportunities, and the once promising town slowly emptied. Today, Conrad has largely disappeared into the landscape of the Kankakee Sands Preserve. Scattered brick ruins and structural remnants lie partially buried beneath drifting sand and wild vegetation. Moving into Warren County, the tiny community of Sloan offers a striking example of what happens when a railroad town loses the very thing that once gave it life. Decades ago, Sloan was a busy agricultural stop along the New York Central Rail line,
where freight cars regularly carried local farmers' harvests to markets far beyond Indiana.
Grain moved through here constantly, and the railway kept the town connected to the wider economy. But when the rail service faded away during the mid-20th century, Sloan's main purpose disappeared almost overnight, leaving the town with little reason to continue growing. Today, very little remains of the community that once depended on that railway. Only a handful of structures survive, and most homes have long since vanished. Towering above the quiet landscape is Sloan's most recognizable landmark, a giant concrete grain elevator that dominates the horizon. Its weathered surface is cracked, stained, and slowly rusting with age. For urban exploration photographers and history enthusiasts, Sloan has become a strangely captivating destination. Against Indiana's wide, flat farmland, the lonely elevator stands like a monument to a bygone agricultural era, a reminder of a time when railroads were the lifeline of rural America. Not far from Sloan lies another place with an equally fascinating past. The small settlement of Kramer was once home to what many considered one of Indiana's most luxurious getaway destinations. It might sound surprising today, but there was a time when some of America's wealthiest visitors, including prominent actors, business leaders, and social elites, traveled to this quiet corner of the state for one unusual attraction: therapeutic mud baths. At the center of it all stood the famous Mud Lavia Springs Hotel, which turned Kramer into an unexpected hotspot for health tourism. The hotel was built above a natural mineral spring that people believed had remarkable healing properties. Visitors arrived seeking relief from illnesses, relaxation, and a taste of high society in a secluded setting. For a time, Mud Lavia Springs was a glittering retreat filled with elegant guests and lively activity. But the story took a tragic turn when the Grand Hotel was destroyed by fire during the 1920s. Since that devastating loss, several attempts have been made to revive Kramer's former glory, yet none of them have succeeded. Today, anyone visiting the old Mud Lavia site will find only moss-covered stone foundations and the remains of an abandoned water bottling facility. The atmosphere feels both haunting and strangely peaceful, offering a quiet reminder that even the most glamorous destinations can fade quickly when fortune turns. After exploring towns that have largely vanished, the next stop takes us to a place that is still holding on, although just barely. New Amsterdam sits quietly along the banks of the Ohio River in Harrison County and holds the distinction of being one of the smallest legally incorporated towns in the entire state of Indiana. The town's population typically hovers somewhere between 25 and 30 residents. Over the years, New Amsterdam has endured a long series of hardships, including devastating floods, especially the massive flood that struck during the 1930s. After that disaster, many residents left and never returned. Visiting the town today feels almost like stepping back in time. The streets are quiet, and the number of occupied houses is so small you could count them on one hand. Although New Amsterdam still technically maintains its local government, its future remains uncertain. With little economic activity and almost no younger generation choosing to stay, the town seems to exist in a fragile pause. quietly waiting to become another forgotten chapter in Indiana's history. New Amsterdam is not the only place slowly slipping into obscurity. Deeper in southern Indiana, Fort Ritner tells an even more isolated story. Tucked away in a narrow valley and often described as one of the most remote communities in the region, the village once played a practical role along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line. In earlier decades, trains passing through the area connected Fort Ritner to larger towns and markets. But over time, the same geographic isolation that once offered quiet opportunity began working against it. With few accessible roads and virtually no public services, the community gradually lost residents as people moved elsewhere. Today, Fort Ritner feels suspended in time. Several old wooden houses still stand along the quiet roads, many leaning slightly with age and long neglect. Some of them sit empty, and in a few cases, belongings left behind by former residents remain scattered inside. There are no grocery stores, no gas stations, and no commercial activity to speak of. The stillness is almost complete. Occasionally, the calm is interrupted by the distant rumble of a passing freight train, yet the train never stops. It simply moves through the valley and disappears again, leaving Fort Ritner in silence once more. The entire place feels like a quiet portrait of a settlement slowly drifting toward permanent sleep. A similar sense of quiet decline can be found in another unusual town, one defined by geography in a very literal way. State Line City sits directly on the border between Indiana and Illinois, with the state line cutting straight through the middle of the community. In its earlier years, this unique position actually worked in the town's favor. Travelers passing between the two states often stopped here for fuel, supplies, and small trade, giving State Line City a modest but steady flow of activity. That rhythm changed dramatically once modern interstate highways were constructed farther away from the town. Traffic that once passed directly through State Line City suddenly vanished, and with it went the local economy. Today, the small downtown area stands mostly quiet. Many of the old brick buildings remain, but their windows are boarded up and their storefronts closed. Only a handful of residents continue to live here, and the atmosphere feels almost ghost-like. Several once familiar business signs still hang outside the aging buildings, swaying gently in the wind as if waiting for customers who stopped coming many decades ago. While State Line City declined after losing highway traffic, another Indiana town faces a very different challenge. Duggar, located in Sullivan County, is not entirely abandoned yet, but it is fighting a difficult battle to survive. For more than a century, the town's identity and economy revolved around one industry. Mines surrounding the area provided jobs for generations of families, and for decades, Duggar existed as a classic mining community built around that work. As the coal industry began to shrink and energy production gradually shifted toward other sources, many of the mines that once supported the town shut down. Without that economic backbone, Duggar started to lose residents year after year. Census data shows a steady population decline during the past decade. One particularly painful moment came when the town's local high school closed several years ago, forcing many younger families to move to larger nearby communities where education and employment opportunities were easier to find. Driving through Duggar today, visitors will notice stretches of empty storefronts along the main road. Yet despite the economic hardship, the people who remain still hold tightly to their community spirit. The challenge, however, is clear. Without new industries or fresh investment, Duggar now appears on the growing list of small American towns that could face abandonment within the next 10 to 20 years. Next on the map is Merome, a small community dramatically perched on a high bluff overlooking the wide valley of the Wabash River. From the edge of town, the view stretches for miles across farmland and winding water, giving Merome one of the most scenic vantage points in southwestern Indiana. In earlier decades, this location made the town strategically important. Riverboats once used the nearby waterway as a transportation route, and the town grew into a modest but lively river port. Marome was also known for the historic Marome Conference Center, which brought visitors and gatherings to the area. As time passed and river commerce gradually declined, the town's economic importance faded with it. Today, Marome still holds onto the architectural beauty of its past. Large Victorian homes line quiet streets, many of them built during a time when the community was far more prosperous. Yet those houses now feel oversized for the town's shrinking population. Several historic buildings remain standing but are clearly aging, their restoration slowed by the simple reality that funding is scarce. Walking through Marome today can feel strangely cinematic, almost like stepping onto the set of a historical film that has long since wrapped production. The scenery is undeniably beautiful, but the energy that once filled the town has quietly slipped away, leaving behind a subtle sense of melancholy. When discussing abandoned places in Indiana, it is impossible to ignore the darker chapters of Gary's story. While Gary is still officially a city, certain neighborhoods have become some of the most recognizable urban ruins in the United States. One of the most haunting landmarks sits near the massive City Methodist Church, a structure that once symbolized the city's wealth and cultural pride during the peak of its industrial era. Gary rose to prominence as a powerhouse of the American steel industry. But that prosperity began unraveling during the 1970s and 1980s as factories closed and jobs disappeared. Entire neighborhoods emptied as families moved away in search of work. Today, the City Methodist Church stands as a powerful symbol of that decline. The enormous 9-story building has lost much of its roof, allowing sunlight, rain, and even trees to grow inside what was once a grand sanctuary. Around it, block after block shows the scars of abandonment, with many houses demolished or destroyed by fire over the years. Gary demonstrates a sobering truth. Ghost towns are not only remote frontier settlements. Even major industrial cities can transform into landscapes of urban silence when the industries that built them disappear. Leaving the urban ruins behind and returning to rural Indiana, we arrive at a quiet village whose identity is tied closely to local legend. Tunnelton, located in Lawrence County, is best known for the nearby Big Tunnel, a historic railroad tunnel that has attracted curiosity and ghost stories for generations. Without that landmark, the small community might have remained largely unknown beyond the surrounding countryside. In its earlier years, Tunnelton supported a modest population of railroad workers and their families who depended on the rail line running through the area. As rail operations declined and employment opportunities vanished, the town slowly began to shrink. Today, Tunnelton consists of only a small collection of aging houses scattered near the railroad tracks. Commercial activity has all but disappeared, and there are few signs of economic renewal. The population continues to age, while younger generations rarely choose to remain in such a quiet and isolated place. Combined with the area's reputation for eerie folklore surrounding the Big Tunnel, Tunnelton grows quieter with every passing year, its future uncertain as the shadows of its past linger over the village. Meanwhile, in Franklin County, there is Metamora, a town whose fate feels strangely suspended between the past and the present. Originally established during the 1830s as a canal town along the historic Whitewater Canal, Metamora managed to preserve a remarkable portion of its early architecture. Walking through its streets today, visitors still see the same narrow buildings, wooden storefronts, and canal-side structures that once served travelers and traders nearly 2 centuries ago. But if you visit outside the busy tourist season, or simply arrive on a quiet weekday, a different reality becomes clear. Very few working-age residents actually live here. Many of the historic buildings that line the town's streets open only on weekends, operating primarily as small tourist shops or seasonal attractions. Outside of those limited hours, the town becomes almost completely still. In practical terms, Metamora no longer functions as a fully self-sustaining community. Instead, it feels more like a carefully preserved historical exhibit than a living town. In many ways, Metamora resembles an open-air museum where visitors can briefly experience the atmosphere of the 19th century. Without the steady support of seasonal tourism and heritage preservation programs, it is very likely that this canal town would have quietly disappeared from the map long ago. In neighboring Ohio County lies a place called Buffalo. The name might sound familiar, but this is not the well-known city in New York. Indiana's Buffalo is something entirely different, one of the quietest and most easily overlooked settlements still technically standing in the United States. During the early 20th century, Buffalo served as a small but important crossroads where local traders and farmers once passed through on their way between rural communities. Today, however, almost nothing remains of that modest activity. A few scattered houses still stand in the surrounding fields, many of them old and weathered by time. Nearby, the overgrown remains of what was once a general store sit partially hidden by vegetation, hinting at the small commercial center that once existed here. There is no prominent sign welcoming visitors into town. In fact, if you are driving through the area and not carefully watching your map, you could easily pass through Buffalo without realizing you have just crossed what used to be a functioning community. And finally, the journey ends with one of the most unusual ghost towns in Indiana, a town that no longer exists on land at all. Monument City once stood in Wabash County, but in 1965 the entire community was evacuated, so the area could be flooded to create the Salamone Reservoir. Like several other towns across the United States that were sacrificed for major water projects, Monument City disappeared beneath the rising waters of the newly formed lake. What makes this place particularly haunting is what happens during periods of extreme drought. When water levels drop dramatically, such as during the severe drought of 2012, the remains of the town begin to reappear. Foundations of old buildings emerge from the mud, fragments of concrete roads become visible again, and even the stumps of trees that died decades ago rise from the lake bed. Photographs of Monument City during these rare moments feel almost surreal, as though the town itself is briefly returning from the past. For a short time, the hidden landscape resurfaces before slowly sinking beneath the water once again. In Indiana, history is not confined to textbooks or archives. It lives in the quiet details scattered across the landscape: cracked brick walls, rusting railroad tracks, and the submerged outlines of homes that once held entire families and communities. These forgotten towns offer a powerful reminder that when industries collapse, transportation routes shift, or nature takes back the land, even thriving places can fade away. What ultimately remains are the stories and the silent traces of lives that once filled these towns with purpose.